Hello and welcome to Teal Talks. I'm Carl Segerström, Chief Talent Officer at MSD. The global workforce is going through a significant transformation. Between changing employee expectations, global labor shortages and the talent race, it's more important than ever for organizations to have a healthy and enticing work environment. Here with me to discuss are Karen Kimbrough, Chief Economist at LinkedIn, Steve Pemberton, Chief Human Resource Officer at WorkHuman, and Sarah Cowes, founder of Swell. Thank you all so much for joining me today. I thought I'd jump straight into some questions. And Steve, if you don't mind, I'll start with you. Here at our company, we haven't seen the most extreme manifestations of the great resignation, but we've seen the tightening of the labor market. As an HR executive, how do you feel this has changed the workforce? And is it still going on in your mind?
What's driving the great resignation, and I'm sure we'll all get into this, is what is another kind of rebranding of what's been happening, which is the Great Reset. And it just requires us as HR leaders and as employers to expand our definition of the human being. You know, the term human resources, ironically, has been around since the late 1890s. And the resources part of human resources referred to human beings really as kind of like raw materials. And it's amazing that the term is still around. But I do think that, in essence, what the labor market has said globally is we want you to emphasize, in employers specifically, we want you to emphasize more of the human in human resources and less emphasis on the resources.
I like that, putting human back in human resources. It sounds like a good mission. Karen, building on that, and you have access to really interesting data from where you sit at LinkedIn. We all read about the amount of employees leaving the workforce. So where are they going? And what factors drive this? And are they coming back?
Sure. So one of the things that we're seeing at LinkedIn, and this is actually a global phenomenon, is that, just after the pandemic, a lot of workers obviously were leaving, they were quitting. But what we thought was really interesting and saw in our data was that a lot of them were they weren't completely pivoting into new careers. Most of them were kind of staying within industry, but going off in search of a new role that offered either better opportunity, more investment in their career path, better benefits and pay, of course. And finally, the big one, much more flexibility. So, nearly half of all applicants on our platform actually apply for at least one remote role. And this is up from, a really infinitesimally small number pre-pandemic, as you can imagine. So one thing everyone's looking for is that flexibility. A lot of that comes through remote or hybrid opportunities.
So Sarah, your reusable water bottle brand Swell has a strong purpose in sustainability. Is purpose something you have or create, or both?
In my experience, it's both, because Swell was founded with purpose and mission at its core, to rid the world of single-use plastics and to give back to people in need. We really I started the company and we started attracting employees and talent in the early days, a dozen years ago, to that mission. And it was a younger employee in the early days in the beginning. But over the last number of years, I've seen that nearly all employees interviewing for new positions with Swell are looking for purpose in their professional lives that aligns with their personal values. So whether it's intrinsically in the company, as it is with your company and with mine, or if it's somehow built into what the company's doing, I think it's really important that employees are seeking some type of purpose in their professional life that merges with their personal values.
Great, thank you. Steve, the term quiet quitting has been trending recently. I always try to look for the opposite. Is it loudly engaging? Is that the positive spin on that term? But I guess there's two different ways to look at it. It's either a somewhat derogatory term that says that employees are taking advantage of their company, or the positive is, are they learning to set boundaries after 2 years of working virtually? But what's your take on this, and what do you see?
So the term or the meaning behind the term has been around for a really, really long time. But Carl, here's what's different about it. And there are two ways that this is different. One, we ought to recognize that the very same people that we are referring to as quietly quitting are also the very same people who stewarded us through a pandemic. They delivered our mail, they stocked our grocery shelves, they helped set up systems and structures that kept society moving. So to be blunt about it, I find it a bit condescending, if not pejorative, to refer to those folks as quietly quitting. What the term also does, Carl, is it kind of removes some of the onus from the employer, and would suggest that we ought not to look further into where that is coming from. But I think the answer is right in front of us. If indeed you leaned on me in the midst of the pandemic, while I'm trying to manage and navigate the complexities of my personal life, caring for young children, worried about aging parents, being in front of a screen for 7 to 8 hours, to refer to me as quitting at anything is not going to sit well with me. What I do think it's indicative, though, is whether or not employers are going to meet humans halfway in their recalibration of what work looks like, how it's done, where it's done, and with whom it's done. And if you don't do that, I'm going to slowly back away from you. That's really what quiet quitting is.
I love that. Thank you. Thanks for sharing. Just building on that, and Sarah, you and I previously had a conversation around our experiencing of managing a purpose-driven workforce. And sometimes you almost see the opposite of so connected to the purpose that you basically got to tell people to leave or go home or stop working. Share about your experiences there.
I really appreciate what Steve's talking about quiet quitting and having people that are disengaged. And I think at the other side of it, you can have employees that are too engaged. And I mean that in a positive way for the company and a negative way for the individual, in that you can love what you do so much that sometimes you need to say, you do need to shut it off at 5 or 6 o'clock. You need to take off weekends. And having an employee base that's very passionate and does find purpose and meaning in what you're doing, I think is incredibly important. But I also think having that work-life balance and being able to allow your teams to take some time off, whether it's, wellness hours, lunch breaks, being a manager that allows leadership and shows that, look, I'm also, logging off at the end of the day and not sending you emails on Sunday afternoon, I think is really important so you don't get to that burnout.
Yeah, terrific. Karen, on this topic of setting boundaries, quiet quitting, what do you see at large, and what's the potential impact to businesses that you see?
What employers are starting to realize is that they need to make the commute worthwhile, because people don't want to come into the office as much. They need to make people feel like the reason you work here is not purpose, as Sarah said, but also engagement with your colleagues. I mean, that's one of the number one things people, when we survey them, say they miss, is the engagement with their colleagues. And so I think if I were going to look forward, I would say right now we're actually starting to see a little bit more worry about layoffs. In fact, there's been a rapid increase in mentions of layoffs on our platform. Posts are about it, up like 10% in the last month or so. It doesn't mean that layoffs are happening more. It just means people are more fearful and concerned about it and sharing that. And so what I think is happening is that the energy is shifting a little bit from the idea that the worker, let's say, holds more cards than they did in the past, to back to where the employer may be holding more cards, and workers are a little bit more anxious about the economic climate.
Thank you. And Steve, moving over to you on that topic, what's your perspective? What do you think are the biggest strategies that employers should pursue to retain and attain top talent?
I do think it begins with creating a culture and an ecosystem of gratitude and recognition, because if the traditional levers of title and compensation are not nearly as effective as they once were, and they're not, and indeed people are looking for meaning and value, well, that extends to the ways in which you drive and create environments of recognition. And the most effective recruiting strategy, by the way, is recruiting the people that you already have. We ought to remember, too, that this is all happening right at the same time a new generation is coming into the workforce. And if you don't have a mobility plan for them, if you don't have an environment of recognizing them, what they're going to do is walk away from you without you really even knowing it. And now there's a people cost for having to recruit all over again and retain people. And then lastly, you do have to you have to walk the talk. Broad statements on inequities and disparities in society that we know humans are looking for in the world of work. You can say those things, but if you are not delivering those things, and you're going to be held accountable, almost to the point where you're seeing this quiet trend, Carl, towards unionizing. And unionizing hasn't been about compensation. It's been about, where do you stand as an organization? If you don't have a diverse board, if you don't have diversity in your leadership team, those things are watched and acknowledged, and you're going to have a generation that says, that's really not for me.
Great advice, Steve. Thank you so much. I'd like to end with a question to each of you. We've arguably seen the largest disruption to workplace and workforce during our lifetime. In your mind, what's the most positive development that came out of this?
I'd say the one thing that came out of this was, as employers were forced to kind of really hunt for talent, they cast a wider net. They were more inclusive. We now see, for example, on our platform, that 1 in 5 jobs don't require a college degree. So employers are starting to rethink how they make job postings and define what the actual, requirements are. And by expanding that, they're including more people who are eligible candidates. And so I think that inclusiveness hopefully will stay.
That's great. Sarah, what about you?
We talked about, making sure that humans aren't an input to business, during this conversation, but they are the business. And as difficult as that has made it for human resources leaders during this time, I think that the most positive thing that has come out of this time is just the increasing emphasis on the social issues and how important the individuals are to leading great teams and to making positive change in the world through those teams.
Agreed. Thank you. And Steve, what about you?
When you have a global pandemic, that did force this recentering of what it means to be a human in the world. I think that though it's a regrettable experience, the outcome of it, I think, ultimately will be positive. You won't take gatherings for granted anymore. You won't take elders of the society upon whom the pandemic landed disproportionately for granted anymore. We'll begin thinking about the people who work for us, whom we work for, and whom we work alongside in terms as a whole individual. As someone who puts young children on a school bus and wants to be home in time for bedtime stories. In other words, for decades, Carl, we've been talking about work life. The pandemic changed that. Now it's, what life do I want to have? I want to be closer to my parents. I want to be there for the most important parts of my child's life. I want to contribute to my community. That's the life I want. The work I do is going to have to fit into that. And I do think that is very, very positive ultimately.
Well said. Thanks, Steve. I love that. So, Sarah, Karen, and Steve, thank you so much for joining this great conversation. I certainly enjoyed it. And thanks to everyone for watching. This has been Teal Talks, and we'll see you next time.